welcome to the deep dive.
Really glad to be here to get into this one.
Yeah, me too. Because when you consider the geopolitical earthquake that was the First World War, your mind probably jumps straight to the Western Front.
Oh, absolutely. That's what we're all taught.
Right. You picture the trench networks carving through France and Belgium, the artillery barrages of the Somme, the attrition of Verdun.
It's the standard narrative.
It is.
Yeah.
But today we are pivoting our focus to a completely different, honestly, severely underexamined theater of that global conflict.
A massively underexamined theater.
Right. We are turning our attention eastward, way east, to analyze the profoundly consequential role of Japan during World War I.
And you know, it is a theater that rarely receives the same mainstream historical oxygen as the European fronts.
Very true.
Yet the decisions made in Tokyo between 1914 and 1919, they essentially architected the entire geopolitical framework of the Asia-Pacific for the remainder of the 20th century.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is.
So our mission for you today, the listener, is to meticulously explore how an island nation capitalized on this massive European distraction.
And used it to transition into a global superpower.
Exactly. We are going to examine the mechanics of their territorial expansion, the fundamental rewiring of their domestic economy, and the aggressive realpolitik that permanently altered the balance of power in the Pacific.
It's a huge story.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to accurately grasp the magnitude of what occurred, we have to look at the global board as it existed in August 1914.
Right, we need to set that stage.
Because imagine you're playing a global strategy game, and all your biggest rivals are suddenly occupied fighting each other on the other side of the board.
What do you do?
You start expanding. That's exactly what Japan did. This was not a nation stumbling into a conflict.
Not at all.
This was a textbook execution of geopolitical opportunism. The European hegemonies had left a power vacuum in the East, and Tokyo recognized that international law and territorial boundaries, well, they only apply when there is someone present to enforce them.
That is the exact strategic baseline we need to establish here.
Right.
Because Japan entered the First World War in 1914 aligned with the Entente powers.
Primarily Great Britain, France, and Russia.
Exactly. But analyzing their entry purely through the lens of alliance obligations completely misses the underlying strategy.
Which was what, exactly?
Well, the political and military leadership in Japan, driven by figures like Foreign Minister Kato Takaki, they viewed the European plunge into war not as a crisis, but as an unparalleled strategic window.
An opportunity.
A massive one. Their objective was twofold, really. First, aggressively expand the Japanese Empire's sphere of influence across the Asian mainland, specifically China.
Okay.
And second, force the Western powers to formally recognize Japan as a top-tier, undisputed great power in whatever post-war order eventually emerged.
And looking at the timeline, the sheer velocity of their maneuvering is just stunning.
It's incredibly fast.
I mean, within the very first week of the conflict breaking out in Europe, Tokyo was already proposing a highly specific arrangement to the United Kingdom.
They didn't waste a single day.
Right. They offered to enter the war on the British side, but the caveat was entirely self-serving.
As these things usually are.
Right. Japan required the explicit green light to dismantle and absorb Germany's colonial possessions in the Pacific.
And the British Admiralty, who were acutely aware of how dangerously overextended their own naval forces were globally, they recognized they had little choice but to accept the offer.
They needed the help.
Desperately. So on August 7th, 1914, London officially requested Japanese military assistance.
Specifically asking them to do what?
Tasking them with neutralizing the Imperial German Navy's East Asia Squadron, which was operating in Chinese waters at the time.
And armed with that formal request, Tokyo just accelerates their timeline.
Put the pedal to the floor.
They issued a stark ultimatum to Imperial Germany on August 15th.
Which Berlin inevitably ignored.
Right, because given their complete preoccupation with the mobilizing armies of France and Russia, they had other things to worry about.
Slightly bigger problems, yeah.
So Japan formally declared war on Germany on August 23rd.
And they immediately followed that up 2 days later on August 25th by declaring war on Austria-Hungary.
And the immediate pretext there was incredibly localized, right?
Oh, yeah. It was highly specific. There was an Austro-Hungarian cruiser, the SMS Kaiserin Elizabeth.
Okay.
And it was anchored in the German-leased port of Qingdao in China.
So when Vienna refused Japanese demands to remove or disarm that specific vessel, Tokyo simply added them to the declaration list.
Yep. So within a month, Japan is officially at war with the Central Powers.
But let's dig into the actual mechanics of how this military machine operated.
Yes, because the internal bureaucracy of the Japanese government at this time is staggering.
It really is. The Imperial Japanese Navy didn't wait for some meticulously crafted mandate from the civilian parliament.
No, not at all.
They essentially acted as an autonomous entity.
What's fascinating here is the institutional independence of the Japanese military branches. It was a structural flaw in their constitution that would have massive ramifications later on. While the Navy operated much like a modern, heavily funded intelligence agency today, they had their own black budget and virtually no civilian oversight.
Wow.
Yeah. They identified the strategic objectives, which were the German island colonies in Micronesia.
Specifically, the Mariana, Carolina, and Marshall Islands, right?
Exactly. And they simply sailed out in October 1914 to take them.
That level of unilateral military action is chilling when you consider the implications for national sovereignty.
It is.
And I have to imagine the German resistance there was negligible, given that their entire logistical lifeline had been severed by the British blockade back in Europe.
It was virtually non-existent. These archipelagos were administered by German colonial officers whose defense capability amounted to basically lightly armed indigenous police forces.
So it was a walkover.
Completely. The Japanese Navy secured these vast, strategically vital territories north of the equator with almost zero friction.
And they didn't hand them over to a civilian colonial administration either.
No, the Navy ruled these islands under direct martial law until 1921.
This highlights a crucial domestic angle.
It does.
Because by executing this rapid, bloodless expansion, the Japanese Navy secured a massive bureaucratic victory over their domestic rivals.
The Imperial Japanese Army.
Exactly. They took these islands, presented them as vital national security assets, and then leveraged that victory to demand an astronomical budget increase.
They successfully negotiated a budget that dwarfed the Army's funding by a factor of 2.
A factor of 2. It is a masterclass in bureaucratic maneuvering, using a global conflict to permanently expand your own institutional power within the government.
And while the Navy was consolidating its grip on the Pacific Islands, joint military operations were actually underway on the Asian mainland, too.
Right. The primary target there was the heavily fortified German leased territory in China's Shandong province.
Centered around the port city of Qingdao or Tsingtao.
And on September 2nd, Japanese forces executed amphibious landings in Shandong and invested the German enclave, initiating the siege of Tsingtao.
And this siege provides one of the most remarkable technological milestones of the entire conflict.
This part is wild to me. We are talking about the autumn of 1914. Aviation is barely a decade old at this point.
Right. The Wright brothers weren't that long ago.
The aircraft are mostly made of canvas and wood and wire. Yet, during the operations around Tsingtao, the Japanese Navy executed the world's first successful naval-launched air raids against both land installations and enemy vessels.
The technological integration there is profound. They utilized a vessel named the Wakamiya, which was technically a seaplane-carrier.
But just to be clear, the mechanics of 1914 naval aviation, this wasn't a flat-top aircraft carrier as we understand them today.
No. The Wakamiya was equipped with heavy grains. It would literally lower French-built Maurice Farman seaplanes into the ocean water.
Okay.
The aircraft would then take off from the water's surface, conduct their bombing runs land back on the water, and be hoisted back aboard by the cranes.
That sounds incredibly tedious, but also amazing for the time.
It was. On September 6th, one of these seaplanes conducted a bombing raid against the Austro-Hungarian cruiser Kaiser and Elizabeth and a German gunboat, the Jaguar.
Now, while the historical records indicate the bombs themselves didn't critically damage the targeted ships, the strategic precedent is what really matters here.
Absolutely.
Launching aircraft from a global naval platform to project power inland against enemy fleets in 1914, it is a terrifyingly accurate preview of the naval warfare doctrines that would dominate the Pacific 30 years later.
It proves Tokyo wasn't merely participating in the war. They were utilizing it as a live-fire laboratory to test cutting-edge military theory.
Yeah. But the siege itself concluded relatively swiftly by World War I standards, right?
Yes. Outnumbered, blockaded, and with zero hope of reinforcement, the German garrison surrendered on November 7th, 1914.
So by the end of the year, Japan had systematically neutralized every German military asset in East Asia and the Pacific.
Fundamentally redrawing the regional map.
But their strategy wasn't purely kinetic either. They understood the necessity of international public relations.
Soft power.
Right. They needed the Western Entente powers to view them not just as a regional strike force, but as an indispensable, highly civilized global ally.
And to that end, they launched several incredibly effective humanitarian and logistical initiatives.
Like what?
Well, in late 1914, the Japanese Red Cross Society mobilized 3 highly specialized medical detachments. Each consisted of a senior surgeon and 20 highly trained nurses.
And rather than keeping them in the Asian theater, they deployed these units directly into the heart of the European carnage.
Yes. Between October and December 1914, these squads arrived in Petrograd in Russia, Paris in France, and Southampton in the United Kingdom.
The logistics of that deployment alone across the globe in 1914 are impressive, but the soft power return on investment was astronomical.
Oh, the arrival of these Japanese medical teams generated massive glowing press coverage across the Allied nations.
Because they were initially slated for a standard 5-month deployment, right?
Right. But the host nations were so overwhelmed by the sheer scale of industrial casualties that they actively petitioned the Japanese government to retain them.
So they stayed longer.
The deployments were ultimately extended to 15 months.
Wow. It was a brilliant diplomatic maneuver, creating a narrative of deep shared sacrifice.
And that integration extended to the naval sphere as well. The Imperial Japanese Navy took on the responsibility of securing vast stretches of Allied shipping lanes.
Give me an example of that.
A prime example occurred on November 1st, 1914, when the Japanese armored cruiser Ibuki actively escorted the massive Australian Imperial Force troop convoy.
Which included the New Zealand contingents, the ANZAX.
Exactly. The Ibuki escorted them safely across the Indian Ocean toward Egypt and the European theaters.
That specific visual is just striking. A heavy cruiser of the Imperial Japanese Navy escorting tens of thousands of Australian and New Zealand soldiers across the globe to fight the Ottoman Empire and Germany.
It perfectly encapsulates the unprecedented interconnected reality of the First World War.
It really does. However, this spirit of unified Allied cooperation, it begins to severely fracture as we examine the events of 1915 and 1916.
Yes, the tone shifts completely here.
Because having secured their immediate military objectives with minimal losses, Tokyo realized that Britain, France, and Russia were entirely consumed by the horrific stalemates in Europe.
They were bleeding out in the trenches.
Exactly. No one was policing the Asia-Pacific. So Japan decided to aggressively test the structural integrity of the international order, specifically regarding China.
And this brings us to a pivotal geopolitical crisis. The 21 demands.
Presented to Chinese President Yuan Shikai in January 1915.
Right. To understand the audacity of this move, we have to recognize that China was in a state of deep internal political fragility following the 1911 revolution.
And Japan sought to exploit that weakness entirely.
Completely. The demands were segmented into 5 distinct groups.
Break those down for us.
Well, the first 4 groups sought massive expansions of Japanese economic and territorial privileges in Shandong, South Manchuria, and Inner Mongolia.
Essentially locking Western capital out of these regions. But looking at this diplomatically, it seems like madness to aggressively alienate the United States and Great Britain right when you are ostensibly fighting a war on their behalf.
It does seem counterintuitive.
What was the internal calculus in Tokyo that made risking the ire of the entire international community seem viable?
The calculus was deeply rooted in realpolitik. The Japanese government believed the Western powers were simply too desperate for Japanese naval assistance to risk a rupture in the alliance.
They thought they had them over a barrel.
They did. Furthermore, the most insidious part of the proposal was Group 5.
Okay, let's talk about Group 5.
This final set of demands would have required the Chinese government to install Japanese advisors into its police forces, its financial ministries, and its military command.
So if implemented, Group 5 would have effectively ended Chinese sovereignty.
Yes. It would have reduced the massive nation to a de facto Japanese protectorate.
Which unsurprisingly triggered an immediate and massive geopolitical backlash. While the Chinese public erupted in fierce anti-Japanese boycotts, the most consequential pushback actually came from Washington.
Right. The United States viewed the 21 demands as a direct assault on the open door policy.
Which was supposed to guarantee equal trading access to China for all Western powers.
Exactly. So U.S. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan issued what became known as the Bryan Note,
explicitly warning Tokyo that the United States would refuse to recognize any agreement that compromised Chinese political or territorial integrity.
And the diplomatic pressure from that was immense. Facing intense isolation and realizing they had fundamentally misjudged the tolerance of the United States, and Britain-Tokyo was forced into a humiliating retreat.
They backed down.
They dropped the draconian Group 5 demands entirely. A severely diluted treaty was eventually signed with China in May 1915.
But while Japan still secured significant economic concessions from that diluted treaty, the diplomatic damage was catastrophic and permanent.
Oh, yes. It shattered any illusion that Japan was a benign actor in the region.
But Tokyo didn't simply retreat into isolation after that humiliation, did they?
No, they immediately pivoted to exploit the fractures within the Entente itself. Germany actually watched this friction and initiated back-channel negotiations throughout 1915.
Trying to broker a separate peace and pull Japan out of the Allied coalition.
Japan entertains the back channels just long enough to weigh their options, but ultimately realized there was zero strategic utility in aligning with a blockaded, geographically isolated Germany.
That makes sense.
Instead, they utilized the leverage of those German overtures to secure their position with another massive power in the region, Imperial Russia.
Which is a remarkable pivot considering the two empires had slaughtered each other in the Russo-Japanese War barely a decade prior.
It is a stunning reversal. But in July 1916, Tokyo and Petrograd signed a highly classified treaty.
And when you examine the text of that 1916 treaty, it is a masterclass in imperial cynicism.
Yeah.
Publicly, it was framed as a mutual pledge not to sign a separate peace with Germany. But the classified annexes effectively carved the Chinese mainland into sovereign spheres of influence.
Yes, they literally used the Chinese Eastern Railway as a geographic butcher's block. Everything north of the tracks was recognized as the Russian sphere of exploitation, and everything to the south belonged to Japan.
And Tokyo managed this dynamic brilliantly. Recognizing that the Tsarist government was bleeding out on the Eastern Front in Europe, Japan actively discouraged Russia from fully annexing territories like Heilongjiang.
Ensuring Japan remained the ultimate undisputed hegemon in the region.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this entire diplomatic sequence, the 21, demands the Bryan Note, the secret Russian pact. It lays bare the fundamental geopolitical fault line of the 20th century.
How so?
The United States was drawing a line in the sand regarding Pacific dominance, and Japan was systematically probing that line, determining exactly what they could take before triggering a military response.
It perfectly illustrates how the architectural plans for the Second World War were drawn up while the First World War was still raging.
Exactly.
And to underscore just how deeply the British Empire was relying on Japanese enforcement during this period, we really have to look at the Singapore Mutiny of February 1915.
That is a fascinating incident.
A massive regiment of Indian troops, deeply integrated into the British colonial military apparatus, mutinied against the local British administration.
Right, in Singapore.
And who did the British governor call upon to suppress a rebellion within their own crown colony?
The Imperial Japanese Navy. Several Japanese warships happened to be docked in Singapore, and heavily armed Japanese Marines were rapidly deployed into the city to engage the mutineers alongside British, French, and Russian detachments.
It is a stark, undeniable admission of imperial exhaustion.
Yes. The British military was stretched so thin across the European and Middle Eastern theaters that they required Japanese combat troops to maintain basic civil order within their own imperial borders.
So by the end of 1916, Japan has established unassailable dominance in the Pacific, tested the diplomatic boundaries of Washington, managed the collapsing Russian Empire, and proven themselves indispensable to British colonial security.
They are holding a lot of cards.
But the question that naturally arises is regarding the central theater of the war. Did this massive, highly capable Japanese military apparatus ever deploy to the primary zones of conflict in Europe?
They absolutely did, and the catalyst was desperation on the part of the Royal Navy.
Tell us about that.
By late 1916, the Allied maritime supply lines in the Mediterranean Sea were on the verge of total systemic collapse.
Because of the U-boats, right?
Exactly, due to the relentless efficiency of the German U-boat campaigns. So in December 1916, the British Admiralty officially requested direct Japanese naval deployments to the Mediterranean.
And Tokyo, operating under Prime Minister Toroshi Masatake, saw another prime opportunity for leverage.
They never miss a beat.
They did not immediately dispatch the fleet out of a sense of Allied solidarity. They countered the British request with a strict condition.
Japan would provide the destroyers, but only if London formally legally guaranteed their support for Japan's permanent post-war annexation of the German Pacific Islands and the Shandong concessions.
It was diplomatic extortion at the highest level.
It was.
And the timing was Impeccable. The British government initially balked, but their strategic reality deteriorated rapidly. On February 1st, 1917, Germany announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare.
Meaning the Kaiser's U-boats were now ordered to sink any vessel, military or civilian, attempting to reach Allied ports.
The threat of national starvation forced London's hand. They formally acceded to Japan's territorial demands.
Having secured their payment in advance, the Japanese Navy mobilized the Second Special Squadron.
Now, this wasn't a token force for public relations, right?
Not at all. This was a highly lethal, purpose-built anti-submarine fleet. They dispatched forces from Singapore to secure the vital sea lanes around Cape Town, South Africa, and sent the core of the squadron directly to the absolute hornet's nest.
The Royal Navy Mediterranean headquarters in Malta.
Right. The deployment was commanded by Rear Admiral Kyushu Sato, who arrived in Malta in April 1917 aboard the cruiser Akashi.
And he brought with him an initial force of 8 modern destroyers, having navigated the complex logistical routes via Colombo and Port Said.
And they continually reinforced that squadron until it became a formidable armada of 17 vessels.
And the fleet composition tells you exactly how seriously they took this mission. They deployed 3 heavy cruisers, the Akashi, the Izumo, and the Nishin.
But the workhorses were the 14 destroyers, primarily the Kaba-class and Momo-class.
To give some technical context, the Kaba-class destroyers were built incredibly rapidly in Japan, specifically for this type of grueling, continuous escort work. They were coal-fired, robust, and designed to absorb the punishment of heavy seas while hunting submarines.
Because their operational theater was arguably the most dangerous maritime environment on Earth at that time.
They were tasked with securing the absolute lifeline of the Allied war effort.
The maritime corridor stretching from the Suez Canal to Marseille in southern France.
Without that specific route remaining open, the massive influx of colonial troops and raw materials from India, Australia, and New Zealand would never reach the meat grinder of the Western Front.
Exactly. The Japanese ships were hunting and being hunted by German and Austro-Hungarian submarine wolf packs operating out of fortified bases in the Adriatic, the Aegean, and Constantinople.
The operational statistics of the Second Special Squadron are staggering. Operating out of Malta, these Japanese crews conducted 348 individual escort sorties.
They successfully shielded 789 Allied vessels.
And we aren't just talking about grain shipments here. Those vessels were transporting roughly 700,000 soldiers.
By successfully delivering nearly 750,000 men to the European battlefields, the Imperial Japanese Navy's contribution to preventing an Entente collapse in 1917, it just cannot be overstated.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. That level of operational tempo in a submarine-infested sea guarantees horrific engagements.
Yes. The Japanese crews demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, ultimately rescuing over 7,000 survivors from Allied ships that had been torpedoed and were actively sinking.
And the most harrowing of these incidents involved the British troop ship SS Transylvania.
The Transylvania disaster perfectly encapsulates the terror of the Mediterranean theater. In May 1917, the troop ship was struck by a German torpedo.
2 Japanese destroyers, the Matsu and the Sakaki, immediately diverted into the debris field.
Despite the active confirmed presence of the enemy submarine, which could have easily reloaded and targeted them while they were stationary.
The Japanese crew spent hours pulling nearly 3,000 drowning soldiers and nurses from the water.
It was an incredible display of naval discipline and humanity. However, the Mediterranean deployment exacted a toll.
Yes, it did. Just weeks after the Transylvania rescue, the destroyer Sakaki was ambushed off the coast of Crete.
An Austro-Hungarian submarine, the U-27, managed to slip through the screen and put a torpedo directly into the Sakaki's forward section.
The resulting detonation was catastrophic, and 59 Japanese sailors were killed instantly.
Over the course of the Mediterranean campaign, 72 Japanese sailors lost their lives. We also see casualties at the highest levels of military liaison work.
Right. Commander Kyusuke Edo, a brilliant Japanese naval attaché embedded with the Royal Navy, was killed when the British dreadnought HMS Vanguard suffered a massive internal magazine explosion while anchored at Scapa Flow.
So Japanese blood was shed to secure European waters, and the operational excellence of the squadron earned them immense respect.
British Admiral George Alexander Ballard went on record with intense praise for the Japanese forces, specifically noting their unparalleled operational readiness rates and their absolute refusal to back down from any escort request, regardless of the weather or the U-boat threat level.
Yet we must also view this deployment through the lens of long-term Japanese strategic acquisition.
Meaning the Malta deployment was essentially a massive technology transfer program.
Exactly. By integrating seamlessly with the Royal Navy, Japanese officers absorbed state-of-the-art British anti-submarine tactics, convoy management protocols, and hydrophone technologies.
They were actively downloading the software of modern naval warfare.
And it gets even more transactional. While they were fighting, they were also acting as defense contractors.
Right. The French Navy was so depleted that Japan actually manufactured and exported 12 Arab-class destroyers, which were essentially upgraded copies of their own Kaba class, directly to France in 1917.
And the ultimate intelligence coup occurred at the end of the war when the Japanese Navy secured 7 surrendered German U-boats as official prizes of war.
Those 7 U-boats were arguably the most valuable assets Japan acquired during the entire conflict.
Unquestionably, they were transported back to naval arsenals in Japan, systematically disassembled and reverse-engineered.
The technological leaps gleaned from German diesel engines and hull designs directly birthed the terrifyingly capable Japanese submarine fleets that would devastate Allied shipping decades later during the Pacific War.
Meanwhile, as the naval war raged in 1917, the overarching geopolitical architecture experienced a massive shockwave.
In April 1917, the United States formally entered World War I.
Suddenly, Washington and Tokyo found themselves as co-belligerents fighting on the same side of a global alliance.
But the reality of that alliance was deeply dysfunctional. The diplomatic relationship was toxic poison by the lingering fallout of the 21 demands, and an intense mutual paranoia regarding post-war dominance in China.
The United States viewed Japan as an aggressive, untrustworthy imperial power, while Japan viewed the United States as a hypocritical hegemon attempting to choke off Japanese economic survival.
To prevent this diplomatic Cold War from turning hot while they were supposedly fighting a common enemy, they attempted a diplomatic bandage. In November 1917, they signed the Lansing-Ishii Agreement.
Ostensibly, it was an agreement to respect the open-door policy in China, but it was riddled with ambiguous language regarding Japan's special interests in the region.
It was a classic diplomatic fudge, temporarily burying the explosive contradictions in the relationship.
It was a temporary fix because as we move into 1918, the internal pressures within Japan were reaching a boiling point. We have extensively discussed the military and diplomatic maneuvering, but the domestic economic transformation occurring within the Japanese home islands was arguably more volatile and historically significant.
The economic data from this period is staggering. With the entire industrial base of Europe dedicated to slaughtering itself, global supply chains collapsed.
The Allied powers desperately needed munitions, textiles, merchant shipping, and raw materials, and they turned to the only industrialized nation outside the blast zone.
Japan. The Japanese economy detonated into an unprecedented hyperboom. Exports didn't just grow, they quadrupled between 1913 and 1918.
This specific mechanism is crucial. The massive influx of European and American capital radically rewired the Japanese financial system. For centuries, Japan had been a debtor nation reliant on foreign capital to fund its modernization.
But by 1918, the geyser of wartime profits transformed Japan into a net creditor nation. The world now owed Tokyo money.
However, the distribution of this wealth was disastrously skewed. The capital concentrated in the hands of the zaibatsu.
The massive monopolistic industrial and financial conglomerates like Mitsubishi Mitsui and Sumitomo.
Yes. Which brings us to the dark underbelly of a massive economic boom driven by external wartime demand.
While the zaibatsu directors were swimming in capital and expanding their shipyards, the rapid influx of cash triggered horrific unchecked inflation across the domestic economy.
The working class saw their wages stagnate while the cost of living went vertical.
And the crisis crystallized around the absolute fundamental staple of the Japanese diet, rice.
The inflation wasn't merely a byproduct of general economic heat, it was exacerbated by rampant predatory speculation. Wealthy rice merchants and agricultural conglomerates utilizing the massive influx of wartime credit actively hoarded rice reserves,
Artificially restricting supply to drive the price into the stratosphere.
Exactly. The situation became entirely untenable. The nation was technically richer than it had ever been, but the urban working class and rural peasantry were facing legitimate starvation.
This catastrophic systemic failure ignited the rice riots of August 1918.
These were not localized protests. This was a massive decentralized uprising of millions of furious citizens that swept across rural towns and major urban centers throughout the home islands.
The violence was so severe and the police forces so overwhelmed that the government had to mobilize the Imperial Japanese Army to brutally suppress its own starving populace.
This raises an important question regarding the structural stability of the Japanese state. You have a society where the military is acquiring vast new territories, and the corporate oligarchs are achieving unprecedented wealth. Yet the civil society is fracturing under the weight of hyperinflation and state violence.
It is a highly unstable societal matrix. And yet, amidst this terrifying domestic chaos, the military establishment remained entirely fixated on external expansion.
Which perfectly transitions us to the most audacious and frankly bizarre military undertaking of the war, the Siberian intervention of 1918.
In the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed into a horrific, multi-factional civil war. The Western Allies, panicked by the ideological contagion of communism and desperate to reopen an Eastern Front against Germany, organized a multinational intervention force.
The stated objective was to deploy to Siberia, rescue the trapped Czechoslovak Legion, and provide logistical support to the anti-communist White Army forces commanded by Admiral Kolchak.
Japan agreed to participate, joining the United States, Britain, and France in sending troops to Vladivostok.
However, the Imperial Japanese Army possessed an entirely different set of operational orders.
Right, they had zero interest in the ideological nuances of the Russian Civil War.
The Japanese General Staff viewed the total collapse of Russian state authority as a once-in-a-century opportunity to permanently eliminate their greatest historical rival in Northeast Asia and physically annex a massive expanse of the Eurasian continent.
The scale of their ambition is almost difficult to comprehend. The initial operational plans drafted by the Japanese military did not call for a limited coastal security force. They planned to deploy an overwhelming army of over 70,000 combat troops.
And their geographical objective wasn't just the maritime provinces they intended to drive, the Japanese military occupation zone all the way west to Lake Baikal.
When you look at a map, Lake Baikal is nestled deep in the heart of Siberia. That would have constituted one of the largest territorial annexations in modern history, establishing a massive buffer state loaded with natural resources.
It was an act of breathtaking imperial overreach, and it immediately triggered a catastrophic diplomatic collision with the United States.
Washington, already deeply paranoid about Japanese intentions following the 21 demands, recognized the deployment for exactly what it was, an imperial land grab.
The U.S. State Department issued fierce, unequivocal ultimatums to Tokyo, demanding they drastically scale back the deployment numbers and restrict their operational footprint.
The diplomatic screaming matches that must have occurred over the telegraph wires between Washington and Tokyo set the stage for decades of animosity.
Japan was ultimately forced to dial back their most extreme territorial ambitions in Siberia due to American pressure, further cementing the deeply held belief within the Japanese military that the United States was the singular existential threat to Japanese destiny.
So as the armistice finally halts the slaughter on the Western Front in November 1918, we must assess the new reality of the Japanese Empire.
The transformation is absolute. They possess an economy heavily industrialized by war profiteering, but structurally weakened by inflation.
They control a massive new archipelago of strategic islands stretching across the Pacific. They hold a physical stranglehold on vital Chinese ports and railways.
And they possess a massive battle-hardened military apparatus that operates with terrifying independence from civilian oversight.
The board has been completely rearranged, and now the victorious powers converge on France to codify this new reality. This brings us to 1919 and the Paris Peace Conference.
For Tokyo, this was the culmination of half a century of rapid modernization and warfare. This was the moment they demanded to be acknowledged not merely as a regional heavyweight, but as a peer among the global elite.
They dispatched an elite diplomatic delegation led by the highly respected elder statesman Marquis Saionji Kinmochi.
Visually, the conference delivered the optics Japan craved. Saionji was seated at the highest levels of power, negotiating directly alongside the Big Four leaders.
Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Emanuele Orlando of Italy.
Japan was officially recognized as one of the Big Five victorious powers shaping the New World Order.
And their diplomats proved highly effective at the negotiating table, securing massive tangible assets. They fought for and won a permanent seat on the Executive Council of the newly established League of Nations,
which was the contemporary equivalent of securing a veto-wielding seat on the UN Security Council today.
Furthermore, the conference ratified the transfer of all former German economic and territorial privileges in China's Shandong province directly to Japan.
And regarding those Pacific island chains the Navy had seized back in 1914, the international community officially legitimized the conquest, granting Japan a Class C mandate over the territories which became known as the South Seas Mandate.
Analyzing the raw geopolitical ledger, Japan achieved virtually every single territorial and institutional objective they had established in 1914.
However, the absolute most critical, historically devastating moment of the entire Paris Peace Conference for Japan involved a seemingly minor procedural vote regarding the Charter of the League of Nations.
Because beyond the land grabs and the railway rights, Japan's ultimate objective was intangible. They wanted ideological parity.
During the drafting of the League of Nations Covenant, the Japanese delegation proposed a specific amendment. They noted that the covenant already contained language guaranteeing religious equality.
So Japan argued that if the League was to be a genuine arbiter of international justice, it required an explicit racial equality clause,
Legally establishing that all member nations and their citizens must be treated equally regardless of race or nationality.
This was a brilliant, highly calculated diplomatic maneuver. It forced the Western imperial powers to confront the foundational hypocrisy of their own colonial systems.
And the Japanese proposal was incredibly well received by the broader assembly. When the amendment was put to a vote, a clear majority of the international delegations voted in favor of adopting the racial equality clause.
But the amendment was violently opposed by the British Empire delegation.
Specifically driven by the virulent racism of Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who was absolutely terrified that a racial equality clause would legally dismantle the white Australia immigration policy.
Facing intense pressure from the British bloc and navigating his own horrific record on racial segregation back in the United States, President Woodrow Wilson, who was serving as the chairman of the committee, executed a devastating parliamentary maneuver.
Despite the clear majority vote in favor of the Japanese proposal, Wilson unilaterally declared that an amendment of such profound significance required a unanimous vote to pass.
Since Britain and the U.S. opposed it, Wilson ruled the racial equality clause defeated.
It was a staggering act of diplomatic duplicity.
The psychological impact of that rejection on the Japanese delegation and the Japanese public cannot be overstated. It was a visceral public humiliation on the world stage.
Despite possessing a massive industrial economy, a world-class navy, and a seat at the highest councils of global governance, the Western powers had explicitly legally refused to recognize the Japanese as their racial equals.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize this data?
Historians universally point to the rejection of the racial equality clause as the catastrophic turning point in 20th century relations between Japan and the West. It annihilated the credibility of the pro-Western liberal politicians within the Japanese government.
The domestic narrative crystallized instantly. We modernized, we adopted your economic systems, we bled for your alliance in the Mediterranean, we built an empire according to your rules, and you still view us as inferior.
And that profound sense of racial and diplomatic betrayal collided violently with a domestic economy that was entering a death spiral.
Because the massive wartime economic boom we discussed earlier was entirely artificial, built on the temporary collapse of European industry.
When the war ended and European factories came back online, the Japanese export bubble violently popped. Japan rapidly hemorrhaged its capital reserves, plunging back into the status of a debtor nation.
The economic contraction was brutal. The massive industrial conglomerates survived, but the financial architecture supporting the broader economy began to buckle.
This instability compounded over the next few years, culminating in the devastating Showa financial crisis of 1927, triggered by a panic over unbacked earthquake bonds and failing regional banks. The civilian government appeared completely impotent, unable to stabilize the economy or secure international respect.
So you have a society trapped in a lethal pressure cooker containing three highly volatile elements. First, you have a civilian democratic apparatus that is widely viewed as corrupt, economically incompetent, and deeply humiliated by the West.
Second, you have a rapidly expanding corporate oligarchy, the zaibatsu, demanding new external markets and resources to survive the economic crash.
And the third absolutely critical element is the institutional memory of the Japanese military.
When the Imperial Army and Navy looked back at the First World War, they did not see the horrors of trench warfare or the grinding attrition of the Somme. The historical data points to a very different lesson learned by the Japanese General Staff.
They experienced the ease of victory.
Exactly. They had successfully annexed vast archipelagos and secured dominance over Chinese provinces with virtually zero military resistance and incredibly low casualties. They had doubled their budgets and secured massive domestic political power through rapid, aggressive unilateral action.
To the militant factions within the Japanese leadership, the First World War proved that aggressive unilateral military expansion was not only highly profitable, but relatively simple and fundamentally consequence-free.
They learned exactly the wrong lessons from a global catastrophe.
And it was the fusion of those elements, economic desperation, profound racial resentment toward the United States and Britain, and the deeply flawed belief in the supremacy of rapid military aggression that directly birthed the hyper-militaristic fascist government that would seize control of Tokyo in the 1930s.
The military simply discarded the weak civilian government and applied the playbook they had perfected in 1914 to their catastrophic invasions of Manchuria, the broader Chinese mainland, and ultimately the initiation of the Pacific War against the Allies.
It is an incredibly dark, phenomenally complex historical arc. We have meticulously tracked Japan's evolution from a regional opportunist executing a naval land grab to an industrial juggernaut protecting Allied fleets in the Mediterranean to a profoundly disillusioned and economically volatile empire stonewalled at the Paris Peace Conference.
Examining this period forces us to acknowledge how global conflicts generate shockwaves that fundamentally reorder the architecture of the world in completely unforeseen ways. While the European powers were entirely consumed by the trauma of surviving the Western Front, they inadvertently facilitated the rapid, permanent transfer of hegemonic power in the Pacific.
They invited a new apex predator to the table and systematically laid the psychological and geopolitical groundwork for a conflict that would dwarf the First World War in its savagery.
Absolutely.
And that brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today. As we analyze the overarching narrative of this period, the concept that continually surfaces is that ease of victory experienced by the Japanese military.
It's a dangerous precedent.
It forces a deeply uncomfortable evaluation of geopolitical strategy. Are the absolute easiest, most bloodless victories actually the most structurally dangerous events a nation can experience? When a geopolitical actor is able to massively expand its borders, double its military funding, and achieve sudden staggering wealth with almost zero friction as Japan did between 1914 and 1915, does it fatally corrupt their institutional understanding of the true horrific cost of war?
That is the question.
Does a string of cheap victories trick a nation's leadership into believing that kinetic military action is simply a reliable mechanical lever for solving complex national crises? It is a highly relevant metric to consider the next time you hear an analyst or a policymaker aggressively advocating for a quick, clean, and easy military intervention. History suggests there is almost always a catastrophic delayed invoice attached to those easy wins, and the brutal reality is that the bill is usually paid in blood by the subsequent generation. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive. Keep rigorously questioning the simplistic historical narratives you think you know, and we will catch you next time.